we have the sketchiest understanding of what our brains are doing. Our brains are doing amazing things. We have a sketchy awareness of that. So it seems deeply possible. This is back to Descartes again. You know, how could a mechanism be doing all these wonderful things? In fact, it's a very, very wonderful mechanism.
All right, welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we're very pleased to welcome Professor Keith Frankish. He is an Honorary Reader at the University of Sheffield, UK, a visiting research fellow with the Open University, and an Adjunct Professor with the Brain and Mind program at the University of Crete. He specializes in the philosophy of mind, psychology, cognitive science. His books include Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness, Consciousness, the Basics, and just one called Consciousness. He also has a variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome Professor Keith Frankish.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Sounds good. So I think this conversation is going to focus, of course, on philosophy of mind and some of the contributions you've made and views you've put forth. But I think as a reasonable place to begin the conversation is where, in a sense, the modern conversation began, with René Descartes. He sort of set the stage, in a way, for the modern thinking on the matter. And so I was wondering if I could just get some of your input on what influences he has had, for better or for worse, on the modern thinking, what people both academically and just on the street, so to speak, think about mind. And so you just get some of your thoughts on that.
Well, there are two Descartes, I guess. There's the real Descartes, and then there's the Descartes of popular imagination, and Descartes as he figures in the philosophy of mind, the short history of philosophy of mind. Most people think of Descartes as a dualist, Cartesian dualism. He thought the mind was a separate entity, soul, immaterial, that wasn't part of the physical world at all and somehow interacted with the physical body. But Descartes himself, the real Descartes, I mean, he did believe that, certainly, but he was a scientist, and he was interested in understanding how things worked, how humans and animals worked, and he thought that animals and humans were complex machines, and he thought that a lot of our behavior and all of animal behavior could be explained in mechanical terms. And he had quite a complicated, for the time quite sophisticated, account of this, the physiology of what was happening when we perceive the world and react to it. It's just that he couldn't see how this kind of mechanical, mechanistic philosophy could explain some of the very fancy intellectual things that we do. Pure thought, cognition, pure cognition, and language use. And he thought that for that, something else was required. That no machine was capable of doing that. So this is where the dualism comes in. The dualism was a solution to it was a response to the limits of the mechanistic picture as he had it, and given the state of science at the time, those were plausible limits. No one could really see how a machine could think. It wasn't really till the 20th century that we got some sort of ideas about how this could be done. So given his position, given his point, location and time, that was a reasonable assumption. But then, of course, this dualism starts to become the big focus. We have this rigid separation there of mind and body in a way that previous thinkers of previous generations hadn't had. They hadn't made this rigorous separation of mind and body, but it comes out of Descartes' search for a mechanistic explanation of human behavior. So then the immaterial soul becomes a focus, the thing that can't be explained mechanistically, and this sort of dominates philosophy of mind for several centuries. It's only in the 20th century that we've started to try to replace this with some genuine explanation, because of course it isn't an explanation at all. It's just positing something, some mysterious thing that does whatever we can't explain. So I'm quite sympathetic to what Descartes was trying to do, and I think that if he were alive today, he would not see a need to posit an immaterial soul. He would see that mechanistic explanation can go much farther than he thought it could. So, in a way, I'm a fan of Descartes. What I'm not a fan of is the influence that his dualism has had upon subsequent thinking about the mind, and still continues to have on thinking about the mind. The trouble is, most modern philosophers and psychologists who think about the mind have got rid of the immaterial soul, but they haven't got rid of the dualistic outlook that goes along with it. That, I think, is the problem. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. So we very quickly seem to get to this idea of the mind as being a sort of essence, as something that's not some kind of machine, that's not some kind of biological machine, but is a kind of irreducible entity or essence that's somehow associated with the brain. The brain is doing all kinds of fancy things that neuroscientists are gradually investigating, which we tend to talk about in terms of information processing and behavioral control. I mean, these are very general terms. But we're starting to map this bit by bit, and it's immensely complex. But then there also seems to be alongside this private world that is known immediately to itself, and that is kind of populated with what we're inclined to wave our hands around and talk about qualities and feels and what it is like in us, the inner aspect of all this. And we can't say much about this except that it's there and it's real and it's powerful and somehow it's related to the brain. And then we kind of just run into the sand, and we start doing metaphysics then and start talking about what kind of a thing this is and how it's related to the physical world, and whether it's a fundamental, this kind of intrinsic nature is a fundamental aspect of all nature, and so on. And I don't know. I think we've taken a very sketchy, impressionistic picture and then tried to do serious metaphysics on it, and I don't think it's taking us anywhere.
Very interesting. And so you've sort of characterized your position as a sort of illusionism. I was wondering if you could first sort of expand on what's meant by that and contrast that with the sort of full-on like eliminativism. What is it that's an illusion, but there's something that we're talking about?
Well, you're right. Okay, so what I'm not saying, a lot of people seem to think I'm saying this, and which is must be my fault because I haven't been clear enough. I'm not saying that we don't see and hear and smell and taste and feel pain and all the other things that we characterize as experience. Of course, all that's real. The question is what's involved in that. So just right now, I can see the screen in front of me, and there's some colors on the screen, yellow and green and so on. I'm having conscious experiences of that. Those images on the screen. Okay, that's real. The question is what's involved in that. Now, there's a common view that at least common in philosophy of mind, that what's involved is being aware of, I feel like, of two colors. I'm aware of the color that's on the screen there, the green, say. But I'm also aware somehow of a mental version of that colour, a sort of mental green. And the thought is that this, you can see that this must be true because it's possible that I'm dreaming or hallucinating or something right now, and there isn't actually any green out there, but there's still the mental green. And there's a way of thinking that this mental green is definitely known to me with certainty, whereas the green out there isn't. And maybe I only know the external world, the world out there, through knowing these mental things, or maybe I know both and I'm aware of both at the same time. Somehow the mental green accompanies my awareness of the worldly green. Now, what I'm illusionist about are these mental versions of worldly properties. I think we're aware of the world around us, and I don't think we're aware of a private mental world of that kind that sort of replicates the properties of the world around us. I do think we have something like introspective abilities, that we are sensitive to what to the nature of our experiences. Experiences here considered as whatever the brain states we're in. And I think that this introspective awareness is what leads us to makes it natural for us to describe ourselves as being acquainted with mental qualities. With this idea that there's this world of private mental qualities, that's not something we've just invented completely out of the blue. I think there are certain capacities we have for introspection and self-monitoring that make that a tempting picture to adopt. That's why I call it an illusion. I don't think it's something that we've just made up. There are features of the way our brains monitor themselves that make that a very tempting view to adopt. That's why, but it's not true. There isn't actually this private world of mental qualities. We don't need to talk about these mental qualities in order to explain what is happening when we have conscious experience. We need to talk instead about our being sensitive to properties out there in the world and reacting to those properties in a certain way, and also being sensitive to our own sensitivity. So we're sensitive to the world, we react to the world, and we're sensitive to our own sensitivity and to our own reactivity. And that's where we get this idea of there being a private world from.
Very interesting. So I'm trying to understand, I guess, we don't want to be advocating some sort of just mere sort of behaviorism here, where we're just, well, all that we have is this inputs, there's kind of the reactions that we have, and there's not really anything more to it than that, mentally speaking. But that's not what you're advocating, right?
There's a sort of behaviorism that I might be tempted to adopt, but it's one, when I talk about reactions here, I don't mean just behavioral reactions. As soon as light hits our eyes, we start reacting, and there's a whole host of psychological reactions that occur that are, in a sense, private and internal. As soon as the brain starts processing stimuli, it's generating responses, all kinds of responses. It's priming us to interpret the next round of stimuli, the next stimulus in a certain way. It's creating emotional responses. It's evoking associations and memories. It's shifting our whole psychological state in a million different subtle ways that we're not explicitly aware of, but that make up a complex psychological reaction. And not only that, we are also sensitive to the shifting nature of that psychological reaction. And that's when we talk about the feel, about what it's like for us. We're talking about that, I think, about our awareness of the impact the world is making on us, this complex psychological impact. Now, that is behavior in the sense that it's a reaction, but doesn't involve me actually doing anything. I could be sitting perfectly quietly in my chair and the world having this rich impact on me, and me being aware of that impact, and therefore tempted to describe myself as having this private inner world. So it's behaviorism only in the most in the sort of most uncontroversial sense, well, in the most sort of milder sense, that it's about reactions. It's not about there being some kind of essence that's of mentality that's created, the essence of feel. It's about there being a massive, complex effect upon me.
Okay. And so would you affirm or deny that there are various mental events, we might say, of visual experiences and auditory experiences and so forth? It's just that we draw mistaken conclusions from those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to what extent our everyday psychological vocabulary, I talk about beliefs and desires and perceptions and emotions and things, to what extent that carves things up in a really helpful way from the point of view of scientific psychology, I don't know, but it certainly carves them up in a way that's useful for everyday purposes. And so it's perfectly true to say that I'm seeing this, I'm feeling that, and whatever, that I have beliefs and desires and hopes and emotions. That all makes, that's getting at something that's really happening. It may not be getting at it in a very in the sort of way that you can go to a neuroscientist and say, which, where exactly is my belief in that belief in my brain, and where exactly which kinds of neuron firing were that experience. It's not going to map on in that really neat way onto the brain activity, but it's perfectly real. Something's happening. We're in a state that we describe in this way, and we communicate about these states. We think about these states. They're important to us. I'm quite happy to be realist about that. It's the qualitative aspect that I don't that I think's illusory.
Right. And so yes, we're fine saying that these phenomenal terms at least denote, we can use them to denote mental events that occur. It's just that when we think there's something more to it, that there's some qualitative aspect or there's some feel to it, that's what's mistaken.
I'm not sure we use the word qualitative. I mean, I'm sorry, phenomenal. That's a philosopher's term. Talk about seeing, experiences, seeing, hearing, things. Yeah. I'm really, I'm inclined to agree with Daniel Dennett that this whole notion of mental qualities is really a philosopher's invention. Again, an invention that may be rooted in some quite natural tendencies we have when we introspect, but it really comes out of the again, going back to Descartes and Galileo and early modern science, that when science presented us with this mechanistic picture of the world, it said, well, look, colors and so on, they're not really out there in the world. What's there are certain patterns of the surface textures that are reflecting light, and the light is hitting your eyes, and that's where the color actually occurs. It's not really out there. There's just this mechanism that we can describe in mathematical terms. So the qualities of things that you experience aren't really in there. So they must be in your mind. Now that's, I think, that's how we get the mental qualities introduced. And then, of course, you get people who go so further and say, and that's all there is. They're just these mental qualities. I don't think. I don't buy that first step. I mean, I think colors are surface properties of out there in the world, to which which make a certain impact upon us. Yes, indeed, and a characterization of these colors, I think, in part reflects how they affect us. So they're surfaces that have a certain kind of effect on us, and it may be monitoring that effect that, gives us the sense that they have this personality all of their own, that red and green, they're not just that feature of the world and that feature of the world. They're features of the world that, for instance, red things seem wider, warmer and more whatever, more advancing, and other colors seem cooler and more whatever. They're all, we can map this out, and a lot of this, I think, is incredibly subtle and not the sort of thing we can easily articulate just by introspection. So I'm not sure where I was going with it. But so once we have colors, if we're happy to say that colors are out there in the world, you don't need to have them in your mind as well. You don't need two sets of colors. That's
yeah. So I mean, I guess my preferred way to think about color is in a sort of along the same lines, I guess, as a sort of dispositionalist view, where something has the color red or another color, insofar as that thing is disposed in some way to produce in me some sort of effect. But that the effect that we're talking about is going to be, I mean, as I talk about them, qualitative. I'm going to be talking about some visual experience that I have. I don't want to say that visual experience is colored, but it's a visual experience that I can refer to in a way. So is there, what is it that's kind of, where have I gone wrong there if I assume that there's something that there isn't?
Not very wrong, I think. Identifiable other than, they are perfectly objective features of the world, but they're only identifiable through our particular sorts of perceptual sensitivities, okay? They're peculiar properties, adjunctive properties that are only unified by the fact that they all have a similar way of companies, by saying that the disposition is to create something qualitative. I think it's to create a kind of impact on us, an impact that we monitor, a vast multi-dimensional, modal impact on us, and which we are able to monitor introspectively, and which we can only describe as what it's like, the feel, the thing, the what it, we're not actually getting at some determinate thing there when we talk about the feel. We're gesturing vaguely at this complex psychological effect. It's again, Dennett uses an example here where he talks of cuteness. We recognize something as being cute. Now, it's like a baby or a kitten or whatever it might be. Now, again, that's a dispositional problem. It's a dispositional to evoke all sorts of responses in us to sort of think, oh, isn't it? It's like a kitten, it's cute and cuddly, and it makes you go, oh, and so on. Now, there, I think it's probably not. Would people want to say that there is a distinct sort of qualitative feeling of cuteness you have, or would they be happy to say in that case that it is just a complex kind of range of psychological effects? I think it's perhaps not so implausible to say that there isn't really a distinct cuteness quale. There's just this effect, this complex effects, and that's what I want to say about all qualities, also sensible qualities in the world. But when we talk about the nature of our experience, we're talking about how about things as affecting us in a certain way. World as it's impinging on us, as it's moving us, as it's sort of pushing or pulling us around, enticing us, pushing us away, whatever. That's what we mean by the nature of experience, what it's like. That's what we're actually tracking. And I think it's a much more dynamical picture. It's not a picture of the world creating this private world of qualities that we somehow sort of contemplate as like in a theatre. It's not. It's the world pushing and pulling and shaping our reactions, and our being aware of that.
Great, that's helpful. And I actually, you mentioned Dennett, and I'm gonna. He has a paper on quantum qualia, and you have a similar paper and along those lines. But before I get to that, questions I had on that, I'm going to get to some other questions from the text chat.
Great.
So, Base Cosmopolitan was wondering. So when we talk about this illusionism, he's really wondering. Well, it's an illusion for whom? You're not going to? Are you denying that there's like a self there for whom the illusion is for, or?
Look, it's an illusion for me. It's not an illusion for a little inner person watching a show in an inner theatre, because that's the whole picture that I'm rejecting. That's the illusion, that the idea is. Look, take a perceptual illusion. Okay, it's not an introspective illusion that I've been talking about. When you have a perceptual illusion, it seems that there's something out there, and there isn't really. Now, one way to think about this, the wrong way to think about it, I think, is that let's say this it's a little bunny rabbit or something that I'm hallucinating. Okay. So is this still working? I got a little thing on the screen.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, good. So say I'm hallucinating a little pink bunny rabbit. Now, one way to think of what's happening there is that there isn't a pink bunny rabbit there, but there's a little sort of image of a bunny rabbit somehow in my mind that's being observed by some sort of inner observer. As Dennett says, like a spectator in that Cartesian theatre, seeing this. Now, if you think about illusion in that way, then of course my suggestion is going to sound really weird, because I seem to be saying that inner image and is itself an illusion. Okay, so I seem to be saying that the Cartesian theatre is an illusion. So, okay, so then if the Cartesian theatre is an illusion, then there must be another Cartesian theatre in which an image of the first Cartesian theatre is being presented, and then another observer watching that. Well, that would be a natural inference to draw if you accept that view of perceptual illusion. But I don't. The very thing that I think is an illusion is the Cartesian theatre itself. So I don't. So when there's a perceptual illusion, when you're having a perceptual illusion, it's not that there's a little image of a bunny rabbit in my mind. It's that I'm reacting to the world. The world is impacting on me, making me respond as if there's a bunny rabbit. Okay, so I'm having all those sorts of psychological and other reactions that I would have if there were a bunny rabbit. That's all that's going on. There isn't an inner image of a bunny rabbit. So similarly, if I have the introspective sense that there's a private world here with a Cartesian theatre, that again is a matter of how I'm responding. I'm sort of monitoring myself now and responding to myself, to my own inner brain processes, ultimately, as if there was a private inner world. And the thing that's responding is just me, the whole organism. Okay, so there's no self here. There's no observer smaller than me, right? And I'm real. I mean, I'm just the person sitting here and talking to you. There's no self that's deceived smaller than me, if you see what I mean. There's no inner observer. That's the illusion.
Right, and Dog also in the chat had a sort of a similar thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of invoking a Cartesian style argument, right? Because in the sense that, well, if the thought might go something like this: if I'm having an illusion, well, it can't be having an illusion that I'm having a phenomenal experience, because an illusion itself is a sort of phenomenal experience.
That's exactly what the illusionist denies. The illusionist denies that that a perceptual illusion, a first order illusion about the external world, involves phenomenality. It involves a phenomenal sort of rendering of whatever it is in qualia, as it were. That's what the illusionist denies. Okay. The illusionist says this whole idea of there being an inner rendering is itself an illusion. So, but then of course we don't want to explain that illusion in the very terms that we're rejecting for perceptual illusion. Okay, and that maybe you might say, well, why do you call it an illusion? Isn't that just going to be a bit confusing here? It is confusing if you hang on to a Cartesian picture of what an illusion is. If you have a Cartesian picture of what an illusion is, then you can't call the Cartesian theatre itself an illusion. Otherwise, you're just in a hopeless mess. And now so I don't have a Cartesian picture of what illusion is. So illusionism, as I express it, is not incoherent in that way. I mean, it might be wrong for other reasons. But maybe another word would have been better. What I was wanting to capture was this. I want to say that these mental qualities, these kinds, don't exist. Okay, so that's a sort of eliminativist position about that. But I also wanted to, I didn't want to, probably just talk about eliminativism. It sounds like we've just made this like ghastly mistake and we've just gone wrong. And we've like, I don't know, the examples are things like phlogiston, this stuff that chemists thought was given off burn or whatever, or I don't know, witches or demons or something. And it's like just a really bad idea. I don't think that it will do just to say, oh, Cartesianism's a bad idea, although I think it is a bad idea. I think it's rooted in introspective capacities and sensitivities that are quite real. That's why I like to talk about it. Just so I think that it sort of piggybacks on it. It's rooted in real and very valuable introspective capacities, just in the way that perceptual illusions are parasitic upon real and very valuable perceptual abilities. But I understand how it creates that that apparent circularity. But I think that's a problem with the word illusion rather than with the position itself.
Great, that's helpful. So a free speech had a question where it says, you have written that illusionism replaces the hard problem with the illusion problem, the problem of explaining how the illusion of phenomenality arises and why it is so powerful. This problem is not easy, but not impossibly hard either. The method is to form hypotheses about the underlying cognitive mechanisms and their bases in neurophysiology and neuroanatomy, drawing on evidence from across the cognitive sciences. So the way to ask the question at the end of that is this different from eliminative materialism? Is mind to be explained or explained away? And I guess the second part is to ask, what progress do you think has been made in this project of accounting for why the illusion occurs?
Right, a good question. Yes, let's just be a bit careful about eliminativism. Eliminativism is often used for the view that folk psychology, in the sense of belief desire psychology, explaining human behavior by talking about the beliefs, desires, and they're not hopes and fears and other propositional attitudes that people have. Propositional attitude psychology. It's often associated. Eliminativism, materialism is often used for the view that folk psychology is a deeply flawed and unproductive way of conceptualizing the mind that should be cast out from psychology. And that's view, of course, associated with Paul and Patricia Churchland. Now, I'm not an eliminativist about folk psychology in that sense. We get into a whole other debate here. What I think about folk psychology, belief desire psychology. I actually think it splits into two different theories, but that's another matter. I'm an eliminativist only about phenomenal properties, qualia, whatever you want to call them, which the Churchlands actually are not eliminativists about. They are reductivists about that.
Right.
They think phenomenal properties are real, but they are just brain properties. So you've got to be quite careful here. And that is one reason why I wanted to avoid using eliminativism for this position, because it's confusing. It confuses this view about phenomenal consciousness with that view about psychology. Now, but the question was that I'm stressing the illusion problem, and yes, that's absolutely right. The term illusionism was meant to capture two things. One, these properties don't exist. Two, they, in some sense, seem to exist. That is, we're disposed to judge that they exist. Certainly, if we're given enough sort of prompting by philosophers and asked the right sort of questions and asked to think about illusions and inverted spectra. So it's quite tempting to think that they exist, and that's something to do with the nature of our introspective capacities, and it may even be, in some sense, hardwired into them. That's why, like an illusion, like a perceptual illusion, not cognitively penetrable. And so that's the term was meant to capture both the negative aspect, denying qualia, and the positive aspect, explaining why we judge that they're a qualia. And that's the illusion problem thing. And the idea is that that's the question we need to answer rather than the hard problem itself. We explain why we think there's a hard problem and why we think we have these properties. And interestingly, of course, that's a problem that everyone has to answer, because everyone accepts that we're disposed to judge this. And the thing is, even if you're a realist about qualia, it's not clear that the qualia themselves, the phenomenal properties, are actually going to play any role in explaining our judgments about them. After all, it's one of the standard arguments for for property dualism turns on the idea that we could conceive of all the reactions and the judgments occurring without the qualia themselves. There's a very strong temptation to think that these things are epiphenomenal in some way. Certainly, it's hard to see how they get into the causal picture that explains our judgments. So this seems quite possible that we could solve we could explain our judgments, our qualia-related reactions, without ever mentioning phenomenal consciousness itself, even if it's real. David Chalmers is quite sympathetic to that view. That great paper, The Meta Problem of Consciousness, published in 2018. The meta problem is essentially the same as what I call the illusion problem. Now, he thinks that if we solved that problem, completely solved it, we had an absolutely exhaustive account of the causal factors involved in producing our judgments and our qualia-related judgments and reports, all the phenomenological reports we produce, we still wouldn't have explained consciousness itself. But still, assuming that account itself wasn't an interactionist one, didn't mention the phenomenal consciousness, we'd still have to, the hard problem would still remain. We'd still have to explain that as well. I think that if we could explain all that, then there wouldn't be a hard problem as well. And I think that's a kind of interesting test case. Suppose we could explain in completely compelling detail why you're inclined to think that you have this private inner world of phenomenal properties, and you were completely convinced that the explanation of your disposition to think that had nothing to do with you actually having such a world, then would you still insist that there is one? And so I make a comparison often with flying saucers. So it's a little bit garbled that, but if I make an analogy with flying saucers, if we could explain all flying saucers, everyone, take out all the people who believe in flying saucers, if we could explain all of their beliefs about flying saucers to their own satisfaction in completely mundane terms, in terms of their seeing weather balloons or strange atmospheric phenomena or whatever it might be, or in terms of hallucinations, they agree that that was a good explanation, a perfectly good explanation of why they believe these things. Would it still be reasonable for them to then go on and say, but still there was a flying saucer there all the same, even though it wasn't what caused my beliefs about it? I don't think it would be. I think it debunked the belief. And I say the same about consciousness. But a lot of people feel that still there's a reality there beyond all the reactions and judgments. That's kind of the issue. But since we're not anywhere near having a complete solution to the illusion problem or the meta problem, it's hard to know how we would feel when we were there. We did have it. Sorry, a bit rambly that, but I hope it.
Oh, that's great.
The other part of the question was, how far are we getting with this problem? We're only right at the start, I think. I mean, there's a lot of work on trying to map the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness, which I think is misguided, since we're trying to. It's impossible to do it if phenomenal properties are even if they were real, if they're essentially private, then there's no way we're going to be able to establish correlations between them and brain activity. But there are people who are starting to think more about the nature of introspection, what introspection is actually modeling. And the work that I would cite here is that of Michael Graziano and his colleagues at Princeton on the modeling of attention schema theory. And they argue that our intuitions about the sort of mysterious non-physicality of the mind arise from the fact that what introspection is actually modeling are the processes of attention, and that our brains model attention as a sort of spotlight. It's useful for us to know where our own attention is directed and where other people's attention is directed. Joint attention is incredibly important in communication. If you want to communicate with somebody, you often need to make sure that you're both attending to the same thing. If you say, look, that thing over there, that's it. You need to be attending to the same thing. And so we need to be able to model each other's attention and perhaps model our own attention as well. And he thinks that the brain models attention as a sort of spotlight that's kind of projecting out of our eyes onto the object. That's how it models it. Now, it's a lot more complicated than this. I'm summarizing very crudely.
Right.
But now we no longer think of it as a projection. People used to think of sight as a projecting in that way in ancient times. But there's still elements of this model that influence how we conceptualize our own minds. When we ask ourselves, what's it like? We're tapping information from this model of our own attention. And all we can really say is, well, there's this kind of like this sort of non-physical thing in here that is grasping that thing out there somehow. It's sort of directing itself at it, and it's somehow grasping it and holding it. And that's attention. It's mechanisms of attention that are being modeled. But all we can say is there's this non-physical mental thing in here that's holding information about the world. And that's how we get this intuition of a private mental world. I think that story it's very promising, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I wrote a little reply to a paper of Graziano's in which I suggested that what introspection is doing is not just modeling attention, but also modeling reaction. It's not just modeling what we're attending to; it's modeling how we're reacting to what we're attending to. It's modeling the impact. So it's as if this immaterial thing is holding information about something and then reacting to it in a rich and complex way, which we can't really articulate, but we can recognize it when it occurs in us. It's that sort of curious multi-dimensional pattern of reaction again. That one, the one that I had the other time. And you know what it's like. And so we just gesture at it like this.
It's a sort of like recognitional concept or something like that.
Exactly, yes. But recognitional, not for a qualia, but for what we're actually recognizing is not a qualia, but a complex multidimensional pattern of information and reaction, sensitivity and reaction. But we can only talk about it as this thing. So I think that's where we need to. We talk about introspection, and philosophers talk about introspection all the time without really having a clue what it is. I think that's where the work needs to be done. We need to understand a lot more about the mechanisms of introspection. And I don't know, the prediction that I would make is that as we model, get to understand more about this, the grip of that the hard problem has on our imaginations will diminish as we see why it is that begin to understand the mechanisms that are making it seem as if there is this Cartesian theatre, this audience watching it and reacting to it. The sense that there really is one will diminish. It's, oh yeah, that's how it seems to us. Of course, that's how it seems to us. This is what our brains are doing. And if our brains are doing that, it would seem to us like that, wouldn't it? Seem here in the sense of inclined us to judge, inclined us to think. So that's where we need to go, I think, looking at what introspection is modeling and how it's modeling it and why it's modeling it.
Great. So earlier in this, in your response here, you talk about sort of the causal story or structure of what leads us to the various judgments that we have, and conceivably we could make the same judgments even without what people believe they have, the qualitative experiences. But let me sort of paint a picture that a physicalist might provide. Look, when we provide this causal story of what leads to our judgments, some of the things we're going to talk about are going to be, the various brain processes and so forth. But on their view, some of those brain processes that feature causally into that story are just going to be identified with. They're just going to be what are those qualitative states that we can refer to in other terms. So where do you think that approach goes wrong?
Well, so the idea here really is they're going to be telling the same story that I'm telling about the introspective modeling of certain not specific, not exactly of brain states, but of complex patterns of brain activity, of complex
Right.
patterns of reaction. And they're going to say, and those are qualia. That's what we're talking about. Those are the things. Now, if what they're saying is when we talk about qualia, about what experience is like, it's actually that stuff we're talking about. That's what our judgments are really tracking. Okay. It's tracking nothing more than these complex patterns of sensitivity and reaction. Well, yeah, that's kind of what I say. In fact, that is what I say. Now, if they say, and those things really are qualia, those things, they really are these sort of pure qualitative. Then I just sort of think, no, I just don't get that, because they're not qualia or phenomenal properties or whatever term we're going to use, in the sense in which people like David Chalmers and qualia non-physicalists are talking, because they're talking about something that they can conceive of as being absent while all of that other stuff is present. Okay, so they're conceiving of something that is quite separate from that. It's conceptually different from that. So now, okay, you can say, well, yes, but two concepts can both converge on the same thing. You can have different, Superman and Clark Kent, two different concepts could be the same thing. Yes, and that doesn't need explaining, really. Clark is Superman, you don't need to, but still, it can be made intelligible in some way that, you can ask, well, okay, how does it come that he sort of seems so different on different occasions? And there's a story you can tell about him changing his clothes and so on, and also about how come this nerdy office guy can fly. Well, he's not actually a nerdy office guy, he's from another planet, and so on. So you can sort of make it intelligible that these two things are the same. But the way we're invited to conceptualize, to think of qualia, as intrinsic features, not relational features, not a matter of functions being performed, they're known to us with a sort of immediacy and certainty that obviously our brain states couldn't be, and so on, and all this kind of picture you get, and we can conceive of them being inverted and so on. Now, I just can't see how you can take those things and make it intelligible that they are just brain states. And I agree with the anti-realists about that, I think. Now, of course, you might say, okay, but they couldn't be, qualia couldn't really be like that. They couldn't really be immediately known in that way and intrinsic and so on. But they're still this feely stuff, and that feely stuff could just be brain stuff. That's what I call diet qualia. People propose this idea of a sort of watered down notion of qualia that is compatible with physicalism. Now, I just don't have a grip on what that is. And so I have this I thought this was clever at the time, and this soft drink metaphor. So you have your classic qualia, which are the heavy duty things that motivate all the non-physicalist positions. And then you have what I call zero qualia, which are just whatever states it is that are causally responsible for our judgments about qualia. Okay, so these can be anything at all, just boring old brain states that, just completely unremarkable. All that's remarkable about them is that they are causally responsible for our judging that we have qualia. Now, and I say now, and then there's supposed to be this intermediate thing, the diet qualia, the things that don't have all the sort of rich and complex things of problematic features of classic qualia, but are something more than mere zero qualia. They have some genuinely qualitative aspect to them, even if it's not private and ineffable and intrinsic. And I just want to press physicalists to say, what's the difference between your diet qualia and my zero qualia? If the proposal is merely that we call zero qualia diet qualia, that we just pin a realist label on what's essentially an illusionist position, then I don't mind really, but I think it's misleading, and it certainly won't convince any of the people who are hardcore realists. It's not going to say we've solved the hard problem. They'll say, no, you haven't. You've just solved the illusion problem with this story. So if all you're doing is just labeling illusionism as a form of realism, well, it's uninteresting, and I think somewhat false advertising. If you think there's something more here than merely zero qualia, than merely dispositions to produce beliefs and other reactions associated that we associate with qualia, then tell me what it is.
Right. So the way you go in that paper is to say, look, we end up with this sort of dilemma. Either we end up committing to some notion of qualia that's so robust that we're committing to something that doesn't in fact exist, or we are saying something purely vacuous, or something that's really not really saying much at all.
It just collapses into illusionism. I mean, I think illusionism just is clear-sighted physicalism. And if you look back at the physicalists of the early materialist identity theorists of the 50s, people like Smart and Place, William Place, they were quite clear about this. Place talks about the phenomenological fallacy. The idea that when you have a green after image, there's something that's kind of sort of literally green somehow in your mind, or in some sense green in your mind. I think they were clearer about it than many latter-day realists. A lot of people, the phenomenal concept strategy has been the thing that a lot of people relied on here. The idea that we just have two distinct ways of conceptualizing the same thing. The neuroscientific way and the introspective phenomenal way, and that these converge on the same thing. I mean, I'm saying the same thing. I'm just saying that the phenomenal concepts mischaracterize the thing they're referring to. We do have introspective concepts of these things, but they're not. Insofar as they're genuinely phenomenal concepts, they misrepresent. So it's really the phenomenal concept strategy plus the idea that phenomenal concepts misrepresent.
Right. And so in that paper, one of the potential replies that you object to, or I guess you separated it two, on behalf of someone who thinks there's this diet notion of qualia, is where we think that it's either a sort of demonstrative or a recognitional concept. And to be honest, I've found you bring up some concerns that we might have for those views, but it looks to me like there's some room for someone to try to develop that view. It's not like something that's clearly ruled out. Maybe could you speak more on that? It's like, is there maybe some room for someone to push back?
A good question. I mean, I've only a sketch memory of what I said in that paper. I think it was fairly sketchy itself, actually. I don't think
about the transparentist thing and anti-transparent.
Yeah. The idea that that it's not introspectively clear to us, where these things are supposed to be located. So, what are we demonstrating? If we're demonstrating something out there, when we say, this quality, are we demonstrating something out there or something in here? And people disagree about this. Some people think it's quite clear that we're demonstrating something private, and some people think they absolutely have no awareness of anything private at all. That we're demonstrating something out there, that the quality is out there. Now, if we're disagreeing so radically about it, I don't see how we can kind of use that kind of inner demonstration to pick out a well-defined explanandum, something that we're trying, that's for our theories of consciousness. It seems that we're dealing with a theoretical notion that some people construct in one way and some people construct in another way. And remember, the aim here is supposedly to identify the thing that needs explaining. If we're not sure whether the thing that needs explaining is a feature of the world or a feature of our own minds or brains, then we're so that was the line of thought. But in general, I think a sort of deeper motivation, I suppose, for what I'm doing is that I don't trust introspection. I mean, introspection is certainly tracking all sorts of interesting things. And what is introspection? This is what we need to do the science. When we introspect introspection and think about intuitions about what introspection is, I don't think we get very far. We certainly have abilities to track our own psychological condition and issue reports on it. But I think it's highly distorting and highly selective process that has been shaped by evolution for very specific purposes, particularly for social purposes. We're social creatures, and it's very useful to be able to tell each other about how it is with us, about what's going on with us, and also, of course, as Daniel Dennett points out, to conceal information about what's going on with us. We could imagine evolution could have equipped us with just a sort of automatic printout thing, so that we're constantly delivering reports on our own experience without really monitoring it or filtering it or paying attention to it. And that might be useful for social purposes, but it would also be quite would also leave us quite vulnerable. Much better to be able to filter it. And this is where we get this sense of the inner world. It's the ability to filter our information and reflect on information about our own psychological state. Now, so I just don't trust. I just don't think that we can sit in our armchairs and establish that there's something here that needs explaining on the basis of pure introspection, other than, of course, our inclinations to describe it, our mental worlds in certain ways. Those are real. What we shouldn't do is take them as sort of authoritative reports, sort of transparent, or that we have transparent access to an inner world.
Interesting. I'll move on quickly to another text question from Emerson Green, who is wondering,
Great.
Is a commitment to physicalism part of your motivation for illusionism? In other words, I guess there's sort of two ways to phrase this question. Do you think that physicalism leads to illusionism naturally? And I guess second, how do I put this? Actually, maybe just start with that question, then I'll rephrase the second version.
I think, well, we need to get precise about what we mean by physicalism and so on.
Right.
And there are many different issues here. I mean, for instance, one issue, for physicalism, what do you say about abstract objects? What do you say about numbers? Are they part of it? I have no idea. I have no view on that. I'm not too bothered about physicalism as such. The physical world is, physics is painting an increasingly weird picture of what the physical world is itself. What I'm interested in is trying to explain the mind, and I don't think. Here's one way of putting what I think. I don't think we need to do metaphysics in order to understand the mind, any more than we need to do metaphysics to understand digestion or reproduction or life or any of these. I don't think it's a sort of fundamental. The mind is consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. Okay, I think we can explain it in terms of biological processes, and that's really where I am now. So I don't think that illusionism, in that sense, is a specific view about consciousness, about consciousness, and it's compatible with thinking that there are all kinds of other. It's compatible with believing in ghosts and spirits and whatever you want. I mean, it's a specific view about consciousness. Now, I do think it's probably, as you put it, probably a natural view for somebody who is a physicalist, who expects to see everything nicely reductively explained right down to the basic level, and that would be my default assumption too. Then this would be the view you'd come to of consciousness, I think. Yes. So there's probably an inference from clear sight, as I said earlier, from clear sight of physicalism to illusionism, but I don't think illusionism requires you to be a physicalist. I don't think that's the only motive for being an illusionist. I mean, look at all Daniel Dennett's arguments for the incoherence of the notion of qualia. That it's that when you put the notion under pressure, it just breaks down, and we don't even have we don't know what to say about our own qualia in certain situations where they're supposed to be a thing that's presented to us most immediately. Yet there are certain situations of change blindness, for example, where we don't know what to say about our own qualia. So that the notion just begins to fragment once you to collapse when you put pressure on it. So that's a good reason for being an illusionist, which has nothing to do with physicalism in a wider picture. It's just a bad picture of consciousness. Similarly, someone might say that demonic possession is a bad account of mental illness, while still being a dualist, a Cartesian dualist.
Right. Interesting. So I had another question myself about. So you have this paper from I think 2007 concerning a sort of anti-zombie argument, and that sort of style of thinking was echoed in a paper by from 2010 by Richard Brown, who we had on a couple weeks ago. Yeah. And I just had a more I guess general question about modal knowledge and sort of the relation between conceivability and possibility. So what do you think we can say in that regard about conceivability as a guide to possibility? And second, how ignorant or skeptical should we be about knowledge about modal facts in general?
Good questions. Let me say straight away, that paper isn't an illusionist paper. I don't think it's
no, you're right. Yeah.
A non-illusionist paper. And I still think the one of the key premises of that is that we can clearly conceive of ourselves as being purely physical systems. Now, I think that's true, but what I don't think, and what Richard does think, is that we can clearly conceive of ourselves as being. Let me get this straight. We can clearly. I agree that we can conceive of consciousness as we have it as being purely physical. I don't believe, though, that we can conceive of consciousness in the inflationary classic qualia sense, in the David Chalmers sense, as being physical. I don't think that, and that's part of the motivation for illusionism. That in that richer sense, it's not conceivable that it's physical. And whereas Richard thinks it is. No, I think I've got that right. Now, I'm actually more sympathetic. You see, there seems to be there is a tension between that paper and what I now say, because one of the reasons for being an illusionist is a rejection of physicalist realism, the idea that a physicalist can be a realist about qualia. And that paper was really a defense of physicalist realism, or at least it could be employed in a defense of physicalist realism, because it's saying that one of the arguments against physicalist realism doesn't work. The argument that we can conceive of all the physical states being duplicated without the phenomenal ones. Now, I think I'm probably now more sympathetic. I am more sympathetic now to the conceivability argument as set out by people like Chalmers. If we start with that classic notion of qualia, I think if you start with that classic notion of qualia, then it is, as I was just saying earlier, I just don't see how you can make intelligible the idea that what we're really talking about here are brain states and patterns of brain activity. So if you read the premise of the argument in the inflated classic qualia sense, then I don't any longer agree with the premise of that argument, of the anti-zombie argument. If you read it in a more neutral way, as just conscious in whatever way we happen to be conscious, then I can certainly conceive of that as being physical. But I think that's because we can view it as the illusionist does. So Well, now Richard takes his version of the argument and reads the first premise that we can conceive of consciousness as we actually as we have it as physical. He endorses that premise when taken in the rich classic qualia sense, or certainly in a stronger than zero qualia sense. Let me try and get back to the nub of your question, which was about the role of conceivability. I do think conceivability plays a role, because this is one of my reasons for being, as I explained to you earlier, for being wary of physicalist realism. I think you have to do something. You can't just say, look, I believe in these really introspectively presented qualitative properties, but they are just patterns of neural activity. That needs to be made intelligible to me, and if it can't be made intelligible, then I'm kind of I'm not happy. So to that extent, I'm more sympathetic to the role of conceivability here than I was when I wrote that paper. The origins of that paper go back a long way. So sorry, that was a bit rambly, but yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you think that someone like Chalmers could agree with just about everything you just said, except disagree with on what notion of experience that we have? Like they'll say that we have this more robust one, and you'll say that, well, we have this sort of illusionist, this notion that's compatible with the sort of illusionism. But in terms of the conceivability arguments, they might agree with you.
Well, hang on. Look, could you just? I'm not quite sure I've got that.
Yeah.
Could Chalmers agree?
So, like, if you set up the you're talking about how you set up the conceivability argument with the sort of classic notion of qualia, and then you're going to say that,
right.
Well, okay,
I got it. Yeah.
I can.
In fact, Chalmers would set it up, not want to invoke the classic notion. He'd want to say, no, I'm just invoking the ordinary notion of, what its likeness of experience, the way it feels, the phenomenal properties, the experience itself. That's all I'm talking about. And then, of course, I say, okay, so you're not just talking about zero qualia. You're not just talking about dispositions to produce the reports and so on, the reactions. And he will say, oh, no, I'm not talking about that. No. So then I start my pressure of, well, so what more are you talking about? And, help me to get some, you're talking about some kind of diet notion, help me to get a grip on this. And I just don't, it's, a sort of a little, it's like being a little bit pregnant. I just don't see how you can have a little bit of a phenomenality. There's all the functional stuff that plays the causal mechanisms involved in producing our judgments. Yeah, okay, I've got a grip on that. But it's supposed to be something more than that. But it's not supposed to be have any of these problematic problem. I lose my grip on it. And come and explain it to me. And just pointing inwardly and going that won't do it for me. That doesn't cut the must. Precise. One reason why it doesn't is because you look at all Dennett's arguments, and they're not. People say, "Oh, look, Dennett and qualia, he was attacking this, the classic, what I call the classic notion of ineffable intrinsic." And they list these features and say that's what he was attacking, and maybe he showed that doesn't hold water, that notion. But still, there's still phenomenality. If you look at what he was actually doing in those papers, in that paper and in subsequent discussions in Consciousness Explained and Sweet Dreams, which is an excellent book, he's pressing one thing. He's pressing us on knowledge of our qualia. Do you know your own qualia? And I think this is exactly the right place to put it, because qualia are supposed to be things that are directly presented to us, whatever we are in this context, in introspection. If they're not, if they're not directly presented to us, if we don't have some kind of immediate acquaintance with them, then illusionism is certainly an option. Because if our awareness of them is indirect, then it may be distorted, partial, fallible, which is exactly what the illusionist says. Okay, so you've got to hold on to something like acquaintance with qualia, direct awareness of them, unmediated awareness of them. And that's what all his intuition pumps put pressure on. The idea that we can know that our own qualia haven't inverted in the last 5 minutes, for instance. And I just wish people would just go back and just really think about these cases. I know they've been widely read and they've been repeated and so on, but I'm not sure that the moral of those thought experiments has been that people have really taken it to heart and really grasped its significance, because it really shoots down this notion of direct awareness, acquaintance. And if you lose that, then I think illusionism wins by default. If we could be wrong about our qualia, then we could be wrong about them being qualitative at all.
Well, what if someone just says, "Oh, like, okay, maybe they are willing to give up on that sort of direct acquaintance view,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll still want to maintain that, well, our justification for thinking that these are these sorts of states or whatever is still quite strong, even if not infallible." And so why would that seriously undermine a realist view or lead us to illusionism?
Well, if we don't have a direct awareness of them, then it's if it's possible that let's talk about introspective representations. If what we have a bunch of introspective representations, which exactly what kind of representations doesn't matter just now, which represent a world of phenomenality of mental qualities. Now, if we accept that those representations could be non-veridical, okay, so their introspection is representing us as having a world of phenomenality that isn't actually there, okay, and producing all the effects that would follow if it were there, appropriate to its being there, but it's not there. If we accept that that's a possibility, and that suggestion is coherent, which is what you accept in giving up on direct acquaintance, then surely the most economical view is that they are non-veridical, given the fact that if they were veridical, we'd have a hard problem. So all of the arguments for non-physicality would then become arguments for non-veridicality once we've given up on direct acquaintance. So I can just direct you to all the arguments for, because surely, the anomalousness of phenomenal consciousness is. It's a point I make in the illusions paper. Anomalousness in itself is a priori evidence. Prima facie. So I'm getting tired. It's prima facie evidence for illusion. If something that doesn't fit into your picture of the world, picture of the rest of the world, then at least take it as your first hypothesis that it's illusory. So all of the arguments for non-physicality then become arguments for illusionism once you give up on direct acquaintance.
Okay, that's helpful. So we've been going for over an hour now. Do you mind just taking a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up, or is that?
No, it's fine. I'm getting a little tired, so it's a little bit later. So I'm happy to do it, but bear with me if it gets even more incoherent.
Yeah, no worries. We'll just go for another 5, 7 minutes.
No, they're great questions, by the way. I'm really enjoying this. It's really it's terrific.
So if David Lee Roth is there, or Canadian Catholic, you can ask your question now.
Yeah. Am I coming in clearly? Sorry for the background. Yeah.
It's good enough.
Yeah. So a couple of questions to you, Dr. Frankish. First, I want to know what your opinions are on functionalism. Do you think that the view is pretty much not worth taking seriously anymore? Do you think there is some versions of it? And I also ask this from many guests. What is your estimation of how serious functionalism is taken in today's analytic philosophy. And the second question I want to ask is, are you, well, of course you're familiar, but have you ever personally met Daniel Dennett? I'm sorry if anybody asked this question already. And what do you generally think about Daniel Dennett and his recent work, especially about the mind? Thank you.
Okay, the first question. Could you tell me what you mean by functionalism exactly? I mean, the word is used in lots of different senses. What do you understand?
Yeah, functionalism, when it comes to philosophy of mind, that sees mental events in terms of function, rather than, I mean, I guess as opposed to like something like identity theory or behaviorism. It's a monistic conception.
Yeah, well, I mean, identity theory in its token form really is pretty much the same as functionalism. I think functionalism's a reasonable way to construe our folk psychological vocabulary. I'm not as regard I'm not for phenomenal consciousness. That's what I want to treat as illusion. But for folk psychology, for things like beliefs and desires, and functionalism's. I'm the view I actually take here is closer to Dennett's intentional stance. So I don't think that they're going to be discrete functional states, with discrete neural bases in the brain corresponding to the sorts of states we pick out with folk psychology. But the general idea that the mind can be characterized in terms of, look, let's put it like this. Yes, this is the core of functionalism, is that the mental states can be characterized in terms of what they do. Their causal role, how they're produced, and what effects they have. That idea, I think, is right and essential, as opposed to conceptualizing them in terms of some intrinsic feel or something like that, sort of intrinsic nature, or in terms of some which might be phenomenal or might be physical, might be particular neural properties. No, the idea that we conceptualize the mind in terms of functions, in terms of states that are produced in a certain way and play a certain role in the mental economy, as it were. Yeah, no, I think that's as good as we get in terms of making sense of our mentalistic vocabulary, what we're talking about. And I think the mental states matter, and they matter to us because of what they're doing, the role they're playing. This is, consciousness matters to us, and it matters not because it has some sort of qualitative essence, but because these states are pushing us around in certain ways. They have effects. They matter in a way that a pure phenomenal field wouldn't matter in itself. It only matter if it had effects. So yeah, I'm all for thinking in terms of causal roles, functions. That's the way to conceptualize the mind. And I think that's something. I think that's the dominant view in philosophy. Maybe now that people are getting much more richer and more sophisticated conceptions of what these functions are, and maybe ones that actually don't any longer align with folk psychology. So if you think of things like dynamical systems theory or predictive processing, you're getting conceptions here of what the brain really is doing that map onto folk psychology in a rather tenuous way. So it's not that the functions that the cognitive science are talking about really are the same as the ones that the folk psychology is talking about. And so to that extent, you've got a sort of position of maybe is this a revision of the folk concepts? Is it an elimination and replacement of them? We can discuss how that goes. I don't think it's a very important issue, but the general idea that we conceptualize the mind in terms of what it does is I think, essential. Now, Daniel Dennett. Yes, I do know. Daniel Dennett, and quite well, and I'm a huge admirer. I'm a disciple of his, and I've admired his work since I started in this field. And I've consistently found his works a source of ideas, inspiration, and I find them very fertile. He's great at giving you a way of thinking that you can then take and apply and extend and develop. And I think I like to say it's that he solved the mind-body problem in this first book in 1969, in which he had a framework for thinking about the relation between psychology, folk psychology, and neuroscience. And he set it out there pretty clearly, and he's unpacked it and enriched it in later work. And it's partly because he writes so clearly and accessibly. I think people sometimes underestimate how profound how far-reaching this vision is, what profound change it requires in our thinking about ourselves. And the reason I find it so important is because it's so fruitful, productive. Once you start thinking, and it's like Darwinism itself in this, that once you start looking at things this way, things start to fall into place that previously seemed disconnected or mysterious or just confusing. It feels right because things start to make sense. Things start to connect up, join together. And my early work on the nature of belief and folk psychology was itself inspired by Dennett's distinction between belief and opinion, two different kinds of belief-like states. And so I worked on that quite a bit. And illusionism, I mean, Dennett is the illusionist, is the master illusionist. He was the one, and he used this term. So I see myself really as just trying to take some of his ideas and maybe develop them a little bit, maybe explore them a bit more, and try and popularize and promote them, because I think he's offering us a different perspective on ourselves from which we don't. Sometimes people think he's telling us we don't have things we value, like free will and consciousness. He's not telling us that. He's telling us to look at these things differently. And when you do, it's really, really illuminating and fruitful. And so, yeah, I'm a big disciple. And as a person, I've huge respect and affection for him as a person too.
All right. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer.
All right. So I think I'll have one more question and then we'll just close. That's all right. So we had a question from Free Speech, who was wondering, what is your sort of illusionist response to Frank Jackson's like Mary's room argument or the knowledge argument?
Yes, of course. Jackson himself no longer, of course, endorses the argument. Well,
right.
Well, I would say that, of course, that Mary will not learn anything when she leaves her room. She will enter a state she has not been in before, which is uncontroversial. She's never actually seen colours before, so she will enter a new neural state, or a new complex state of sensitivity and reaction that she had not been in before. That's uncontroversial. And if she's monitoring that state introspectively, she will also be in an introspective state she's not been in before. So there'll be all sorts of, if we think of this, say, in informational terms, there'll be all sorts of information. She'll be in a complex informational state that she had never been in before. But none of this information was information that was not accessible to her previously in her room. She's not, none of what's being represented either perceptually or introspectively is none of the facts that are being represented in that way when she leaves the room are ones that were inaccessible to her before, though this particular complex of representations is a novel one. She's never actually represented the world as being in this way right at this moment, right now. But it's not that she would gain access to a dimension of reality that she had that had previously been closed to her. And of course, you know, again, Dennett has this nice example. You know, you try and trick her when she comes out, and you show her a banana that you've painted blue, and hoping that she'll see that it's a banana, of course, and she'll think it's yellow, and she'll say, "Oh, that's what yellow looks like." And of course, no, she says, "No, you're trying to trick me. That's blue." And you'll say, "Well, how did you know that?" And she says, "Well, of course, I remember. I knew exactly what would happen when I saw something blue. I know exactly what effects it would have on me, what kind of reactions it would produce in me, psychological reactions, what sort of associations and other things or whatever it trigger in me, and so on, and what emotional effect it would have, and so on. And I knew all that, and I recognized it was doing that, so I concluded it was blue. Of course, the whole example is incredibly artificial, and it seems plausible because we can imagine somebody just sitting there and just reading a few textbooks about vision, and then not knowing, you know, being surprised when they see colors. But it just massively underestimates the complexity of the situation, the complexity of the effects that having experiencing color would have on you. The thing to I was going to say something, and I've forgotten what it was now. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a dead end, but I can't remember where I was going to go there. Sorry, I'm sorry. I was just going to say the thing to remember is, and it was going to be a really nice summary of the whole thing. I forgot what it was now. It was a good point as well.
But she doesn't. That she doesn't really learn anything new. All the stuff she knew beforehand. So.
Oh, she doesn't. No, that's what you have to say. Well, not what you have to say. It's what you want to say. Of course, as I said, the whole example is completely contrived because she wouldn't have developed the kinds of the neural circuitry needed for color vision if she hadn't been properly stimulated during development. So it's, and I think that actually is important to the example, because learning what it's like to see color is learning what impact color makes on you. So, you know, when we talk about what it's like, we're just talking about the complex psychological reactions that different colors produce. Now, of course, they don't produce any reactions here because she's never developed any of these sensitivities. So, I mean, if you take people who actually have had some similar, people who had, I think, cataracts removed, and there are other conditions where something sort of similar to this has happened. I think Nicholas Humphrey discusses one and was involved in investigating one. It's actually, so a person has been had fairly limited vision or even blind, and is given has an operation that recovers some of their sight. It's actually quite painful and disorienting, and they don't. It's not that they suddenly see a beautifully rendered, sort of three-dimensional world out there. It's really quite, the stimulation is kind of strange and stressful and frightening, and they can't interpret it. And they actually sometimes put back on their dark glasses and try to hide from this, avoid this kind of light. So, I mean, it's a great example of a philosophical thought experiment that's designed, as Dennett says, to pump a certain intuition, and it pumps that intuition very nicely. But the problem with intuition pumps is you only get out what you put in. You start with a certain kind of concept, and you pump away, and you get some you get a sort of strengthened conviction that way of conceptualizing the thing is right. They're not. I don't think they're really ways of investigating the world. They're ways of highlighting the commitments you've already got.
All right, I think we'll end there. I think I'll just leave on sort of meta note. Like all of this, I find very interesting. I think a lot of people here do as well. Just describing our mental lives and situating that in a broader picture of the world is difficult, but worthwhile. And the various positions we take to define that space of responses, the phenomena we take as the subject matter, the arguments that Evan's put forth, all of these comprise a complex and tricky terrain. So I'll close by thank you again for joining us, and in your work generally for helping us to navigate it.
Well, thanks for your questions. It's and for all the questions from the other participants. It's been terrific. They were great questions and a great level of discussion. I think on your closing point there was right. Absolutely right. I think if you think about what we're doing, what kind of systems we are, the complexity of our sensory engagement with the world and the complexity of our introspective monitoring of that engagement, would it not be very surprising if we didn't find something here, didn't start to conceptualize ourselves as strange and non-physical and weird? It would be strange if we just thought, oh well, this is just perfectly kind of unpuzzling. Our brains do such amazing things that unless we understood unless we can't grasp what they're doing. Perhaps in the future we can. We're not Mary. We can't grasp this in a level of detail. We have the sketchiest understanding of what our brains are doing. Our brains are doing amazing things. We have a sketchy awareness of that. So it seems deeply possible. This is back to Descartes. How could a mechanism be doing all these wonderful things? The fact is, it's a very, very wonderful mechanism.
That's a good point, Dan. Thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure too.